everybody. Welcome to this beautiful, beautiful room. I think we have, those of you standing up back there, we have some openings in the middle here. And go ahead and find a seat. I'm sure that people will not mind you walking through, kind of like a movie theater, right? So come on in and find a place. This is a great room for slides and for these kind of gatherings. We've been here a couple of times. It's really a nice venue. Okay, good. Welcome. My name's Mike Denham, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our November edition of the Florida Lecture Series, produced by the Lawton Child Center for Florida History. And I want to recognize President Martin out there. He's kind of moving back and forth between venues. The life of a college president, always something going on, right? If you are with us for the first time, I forgot your lovely wife, Tina. Welcome. If you're with us for the first time, I want to give you a special welcome and encourage you to get a lecture series brochure and visit Isabel outside. Many of you have already done that, and get an extra one. And if you're not on our mailing list, please get on our mailing list out there. There's a sign-up sheet and also an email list that you can be in touch with us. We send out a email blast, I guess about a week before these, to remind everybody. Before I introduce tonight's special guest, I want to let you know about two additional programs we're going to have before the first of the year. And they have kind of come to us, and it's been wonderful to have a couple of extra programs. And the first of those two is next week on November 21st in a program sponsored with Historic Lakeland Incorporated. As you know, every year we kind of partner with them for their annual meeting, and this year we're doing the same. And the program for that evening, which everyone, of course, is invited to, is a program by two individuals, Paul Esbach and Jonathan Rich, who are from Orlando. And they've written an award-winning book, Spires in the Sun, The Carpenter Gothic Episcopal Churches of Florida. Many of you are familiar with those old 19th century Gothic Episcopal churches scattered all over the state in little places like Willaca, Florida, and Palatka, Florida, and Fort Meade. Anyway, they're beautiful, beautiful architectural structures, and that program will feature a lot of slides and rich photographs and stories. Even better than that, stories around these communities where the church really kind of emerged. These are surviving wood frame Episcopal churches. That program will start at 7 in Florida Southern College's Hollis Room. Many of you are familiar with the Hollis Room. Right up the hill up here, it's a circular room, which is originally Frank Lloyd Wright designed room. Then, on December 5th, we'll welcome FSC Professor Risden Slate. Many people in this room know and admire Professor Slate, Dr. Slate, who just retired last year. He is going to share, sign, and discuss his memoir, which he has just written. It's a wonderful book. It's called Resilience in the Storm, My Journey with Mental Illness. Professor Slate has been teaching, he's taught at this school for about 30 years, and of course, he's one of my best friends, and many people in this room know about his battle, I guess you'd say, with mental illness. And of course, this is a terrific memoir, which I've read before it was even published, and it's just a terrific book. And that is going to be December 5th. December 5th in the McKay Archives, up the hill in the McKay Archives, on the second floor of the McKay Archives. And that will start at 6 o'clock. And you can get flyers outside about both of those two programs if you haven't gotten them already. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's special guest. And tonight our topic, of course, is Florida's Everglades, especially its transformation from the river of grass into a labor migration into a hemispheric hub for agriculture production and labor migration. And of course, we're also going to learn about the trajectory of Florida's farm workers movement as well along the way. For Charlie Fanning, this is a familiar setting, as much as it is a kind of homecoming. He earned his BA here with a double major in history and Spanish, and Charlie ran cross country. He was, of course, always doggedly working and working and working and working. He was one of our first Florida Citrus Scholars, or Florida Citrus Research Fellows, I should say. And he and I worked very closely with Luann Mims. Where is Luann? Luann Mims is there. And we worked very, very closely with Charlie and some of his colleagues, setting up the first database for the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame. And he and his colleagues wrote biographical studies or sketches of all of the Florida Citrus, at the time, all of the Florida Citrus Hall of Fame members. And they kind of worked from scratch. And we worked with them and worked with them and worked with them and edited and fired stuff back. And it was a lot of fun. But their work is still being used today, the database. If anybody is interested, they can just go to Florida Citrus Hall of Fame, just Google it, and the biographical sketches of all of the individuals were on there. And they were really the first to begin that process. Charlie was an honor student, and he earned the Outstanding History Major degree when he graduated in 2010. From there, Charlie moved to the Washington, D.C. area. He earned his master's degree at Georgetown and worked for numerous organizations focusing on domestic and global labor issues. And while working on his doctorate from University of Maryland, he enjoyed research grants from the University of Maryland, Duke University, Wayne State University, and the University of Florida. Currently, Charlie teaches at the University of Florida. He was able, unlike most recent graduates who have to hang out applying for jobs, Charlie was lucky. He got a job pretty quickly after he graduated. I want to recognize Charlie's wife, Adrienne. Where is she? There's Adrienne, of course. She was a graduate, 2010 graduate, okay, with Charlie. And also his parents are here as well. They came in from, let's see, where did they come in from? St. Pete, I believe, and in Tampa, okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Charlie Fanning to our stage.
It really is a personal honor to be here with you all. Thank you all for coming. Florida Southern is a really special place for me, for my wife. See so many familiar faces in the room. Luann, gave me my first professional history job. Dr. Frank Hodges was a great advisor and mentor in the history department. I saw Dr. Jose Garcia in Spanish, took many classes with him. We went to Spain together. And of course, Dr. Mike Denham, thank you so much for bringing me here. You've been a great mentor and champion of my work over the years. Mr. President, thank you for being here. Wow. But really, thank you all. It's an honor to be a part of this lecture series. This is a great resource on campus, great resource for the students of Florida Southern and the Lakeland community. And I'm thrilled to be a part of this lineup this year. So let's get into it. Our animating question for this evening. How did agricultural interests transform rural South Florida from a river of grass into a global hub for commodity production, investment, and migration? So I'm going to trace an argument through my lecture this evening that it was agricultural coordination, economic and political coordination among growers that fostered and facilitated the rise of industrial agriculture in the region and transformed the Everglades from this river of grass into what you see today, which is a highly engineered landscape that produces, I brought props this evening, that produces the most sugar, cane sugar in the producer of winter vegetables like this very hard tomato that I picked up at Publix and the celery. Those will come back later this evening. And they did this in really three ways, and that was coordinating to secure environmental control, federal investments in water management by capitalizing on disasters in the 1920s and 30s, by shaping and making markets. Through coordination, growers consolidated the landscape and concentrated production in South Florida, and fostered the rise, the exponential growth of sugar production in the Everglades region after the Cuban Revolution. And finally, by moving and managing labor by developing labor recruitment systems and bringing in diverse groups of migrant workers, changed over time and really changed the social landscape of South Florida. Before we really get into it, I want to situate ourselves to the region. The large photo here is the historic river of grass, overlaid on a map of modern day Florida. Does anyone know why we call the Everglades the river of grass, where that term comes from? Maybe participatory, maybe.
Is it from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas?
That's right, yes. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She popularized that term in 1947 in her book by the same name. She was drawing from an older Seminole term, Pahokee. There's an agricultural town near Lake Okeechobee called Pahokee, and that means grassy river. And that's a descriptive term of the ecosystem of the Everglades, which, if you see this map here, the Everglades was formed over 5,000 plus years of water flowing from the Kissimmee River Basin through Lake Okeechobee, and then there was a slow southward slope, a flow of water south from the Lake Okeechobee through the southern part of the peninsula. And over time, that formed this complex ecosystem of sawgrass prairies and cypress swamps, marshes, and peat bogs. It's a very unique ecosystem. It's one of the largest wetlands ecosystems in the world. So how did we go from this, which in 1900, the census declared southern Florida to be uninhabited. There were, of course, Seminole Indians inhabiting the Everglades, and there were some hardscrabble farmers and plume hunters and outlaws hanging around, but it was a relatively remote place that looked much like the historic river of grass at the turn of the century. My talk is mainly focusing on the 1920s to 1960s, but I'm taking a little bit of a prerogative as a historian. I'm starting way earlier, and I'm going to end a little bit later. So we're 1904. That's where I'm going to start this tale. Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, a populous governor of Florida, sought to drain what he called the pestilence-ridden swamp for small farmers. He was hoping to bolster his populist appeal and bring in an egalitarian landscape of small farmers. Early attempts to drain the Everglades mainly resulted in failure. They marketed this land as ideal for growing sugarcane and fresh winter produce, but they ran into numerous difficulties with drainage, natural disasters. There were major hurricanes in 1926 and 1928, and by the end of the 1920s, it was an open question whether or not this project would be whether or not the state and investors could achieve this project of developing agriculture in the Everglades. But by the 1960s, Florida was producing more sugar than any state in the country. They surpassed Louisiana and Hawaii, more cane sugar. And the footprint of the wetlands ecosystem in South Florida was reduced by 50% through through urban and agricultural development. So this is a remarkable story. The Everglades agricultural sector also ushered in an era of corporate consolidation in Florida. Florida actually, by the end of the 1960s, could claim the highest concentration of corporate farms in the country, with over 1/3 of farmland owned by a corporate entity. So that's the problem we're going to solve this evening, is answering that question. How did that happen? So I'll situate ourselves a little bit more with some of the towns we're talking about here. Like if you look at this river of grass and juxtapose it with the highway map here, you can see how much this project fostered both agricultural development and urban development. And then this map on top is a Google Earth shot of South Florida today, where you can see the density along the coast, on both sides of the coast. And below Lake Okeechobee, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see uniform rows of cane fields and vegetable production and flood control installations. So it's a highly engineered environment, and we're going to talk about how we got there. So I'm first going to talk about the rise of environmental control, flood control in South Florida. And that really took place through the 1920s through the 1940s. Through hurricane suppression and war, investors, growers, and landed interests established industrial farming on an industrial scale by capitalizing on crises to secure federal interventions in labor and environmental control. They used disasters as a catalyst to promote development. And I'm borrowing here from Naomi Klein, who's a social critic and journalist, who coined the term disaster capitalism to talk about the ways that corporations and investors have capitalized on disaster to remake landscapes, push through reforms, and promote development. And you can really see that at work in the 1920s, 30s, through the 1940s in the Everglades. Through the 1940s, gradually, organized agricultural interests drew in the federal government, brought in the Army Corps of Engineers through extensive lobbying efforts to start to install flood control installations and make the region safe for production. In the 1920s, the state of farming was pretty dismal. There were around 2,000 people in 1921 living around Lake Okeechobee. These were mainly out-of-state small farmers who came in to try and scrape a living on the landscape. During the 1920s, you're all familiar with Florida history. I'm looking forward to questions this evening. But through the 1920s, there was a land boom. There was wild speculation on land. There were companies advertising Everglades land throughout the Midwest, trying to lure in farmers to grow. They were saying it's muck soil, like you'll barely have to do anything to grow in the Everglades. It'll be easy. When these people arrived here, most of the time their plots that they purchased without seeing were flooded. They were covered in water or covered in mangroves, something like that. Around 2,000 people scraped out a living near Lake Okeechobee by manually removing mangroves, very difficult, laborious work. Around this time, you also had some well-capitalized interests, often with ties to northern capital, start to invest in the region as well, hoping to produce sugar on an industrial scale. So one of those firms was the Southern Sugar Corporation, started by a man named Roald Dahlberg. That company was one of the first to install private drainage. They installed pumping stations and canals and levees throughout their 40,000 acres near Clewiston, which is right below Lake Okeechobee. These interests kind of started to try and demonstrate a proof of concept that you could have industrial agriculture in the region by securing flood control. This all kind of came crashing down in 1926 and 1928. There were consecutive hurricanes. September 1926, a hurricane roared through Miami and then passed over Moorhaven, leaving settlements flooded throughout the Everglades, killed 800 people and caused about $100 million worth of damage. And that brought this investment craze in Florida. The land sales, the speculative real estate deals came crashing down. There was a bust. And the economy of Florida crumbled a couple years before the Great Depression, actually contributed to the Great Depression. So Florida was in a depression before the rest of the country because of this land bust. 1928, the region gets hit by another hurricane, one of the deadliest in U.S. history. This was made famous in Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. The hurricane hit, it killed around 2,500 people. Most of those were migrant workers. So as they're starting to establish agriculture in the region, you have these itinerant farm workers coming through from the Caribbean, from the South. And when the hurricane roars, they're living in settlements. There's no investment really in housing. And when the hurricane roars through, it kills 2,500 people. And Zora Neale Hurston describes this as the beast leaving its bed. It passed through Lake Okeechobee, and there was a 12-foot storm surge that passed through the Everglades. So you can actually see a photo here of Belle Glade, which was one of the worst areas that was hit. I'll save that picture for later, though. These disasters sparked the investors, the growers, the early industrial growers, Chamber of Commerce figures, elected officials to start pushing for flood control in a concerted way in the region. They formed in 1928 the Florida Navigation and Flood Control Association. Roald Dahlberg, the head of Southern Sugar, brought in Herbert Hoover to tour the disaster, who was a career engineer and federal aid official before this. Dahlberg was actually his lead fundraiser in Florida. He helped deliver the state to Hoover, the first Republican candidate to take Florida since Reconstruction. So there were maybe some favors that were owed. And in 1930, once after Hoover took office, a bill goes through Congress, and it authorizes the Army Corps of Engineers to initiate to build a dike south of Lake Okeechobee that eventually became known as the Hoover Dike. It's now 143 miles and 30 feet high. It covers the southern perimeter of Lake Okeechobee. And if you think about the flow of water, so here's what it looks like here. So you have a little Army Corps of Engineers marketing material here, and this is now a modern picture of the Hoover Dike. It's massive. It's a massive installation. And if you think about the southern flow of water from the Everglades, that would obviously cause some ecological problems. It started to dry out the muckland south of the lake. There were numerous forest fires, soil erosion, saltwater intrusion, but it also added a degree of security. So between 1929 and 1943, vegetable acreage grew. The vegetable acreage production grew from 17,000 acres under production to 110,000 acres under production. So a massive growth. Sugar went from 7,000 to about 30,000. So you see how important flood control was to establishing a foothold in the glades. Through this period of crisis, through the land bust and depression, these disasters, small farmers are folding left and right. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, she reports that the mucklands came more and more in the hands of large corporations. And these investors could buy up land cheaply at this point. The state is trying to offload land. Farms are in foreclosure, so you start to see land start to concentrate in large investors. And these investors are pushing for more and more engineering. And once engineers start to engineer, they continue to engineer, and that's kind of what we see here. And so in 1948, we get the next massive project in the Glades, which is the central and southern Florida project for flood control. This was actually mainly spearheaded. The lobbying effort for this was spearheaded by U.S. Sugar, which took over for Southern Sugar. That was the U.S. Sugar was co-founded by Charles Stewart Mott, who is the co-founder of General Motors, and he put together a group of investors to buy Southern Sugar, which went under during the Depression years. So U.S. Sugar, its lobbying team, puts together groups of agricultural interests to push for this project. It goes through after a series of floods and years of drought in 1948. And this project, it covers 15,000 square miles in South Florida. So this map here, it shows you just how extensive these flood control installations are. We have pumping stations, levees, canals, all through the southern half of the peninsula. And it feeds in and it's integrated into the Hoover Canal system. And the purpose of this system was not flood control like the dike, but this is about water management. So this system is engineered to move water where the people want it to go, where public officials want it to go, where water control boards deem that where water should go. So it's going to first cities on the coast, then it's going to sugar and vegetable growers, then it's going to the Everglades National Park, which was founded in 1948, and then it's going to any other uninhabited land. So last on the list is the Everglades ecosystem. And while this solved the problem of soil erosion and periodic flooding and fires, it brought havoc on the overall ecosystem that we're still dealing with today. And as part of this project, there was a massive giveaway to agricultural interests. They established what's called the Everglades Agricultural Area south of Lake Okeechobee, which is 700,000 acres, some 27% of the Everglades ecosystem, developed exclusively for use for agricultural production. So this is an aerial view of sugarcane fields in that Everglades agricultural area. It's just the acreage south of Lake Okeechobee. And this also signaled that the Everglades was ripe for development. So from the 1950s to the late 1960s, the developed footprint of whether it's urban development, suburbs, agriculture, was only 150 square miles in 1950. By the late 1960s, it was nearly 700 square miles. So this was a game changer for the development of the Everglades, and really set a foundation for the exponential growth that we see that I'll get to in the 1950s and 60s of agricultural production. But of course, someone needs to pick these crops. Someone needs to cut the sugar cane. And as growers are dealing with the issues of flood control, they're also dealing with problems of labor control. So as I mentioned, prior to this, most of labor was performed in a somewhat informal basis by migratory workers who would kind of circulate through the South, and then seasonal workers from the Bahamas and Jamaica would come and work the cane fields and the vegetable farms. This starts to get more formalized over time, and growers hit what they claim to be a labor shortage crisis in the New Deal era. So historically, there's maybe 60,000 workers would come every season to work the Everglades fields, and they were getting paid poverty wages, living in destitute conditions, no investment in housing. Housing was a major issue. So during the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration initiates the Farm Security Administration, which has a charge to build clean housing and offer social services and programs to migrant workers. They built this Okeechobee labor camp in 1940 near Belglade, and it offers schooling for the migrants' children. It offers training for the adults. It's a safe, clean, sanitary environment. It's often the first time many of these workers had lived in conditions that were enclosed and not exposed to the elements. And because these were secure living quarters, no one was forcing these people to go out and work anymore. So before, they might be dependent on growers for shabby housing, and it didn't really have any other place to go if they were recruited from out of state to work in the Everglades. But in this labor camp, they had a little more security. So then they start to get together and understand that they might have a little bit of leverage. If they're in the growing season, maybe they decide collectively that they're not going to go out and pick tomatoes that day if they're not getting paid enough. So you start to see sit-down strikes in the bean fields and the tomato fields of the glades, and of course that sets off a collective panic among growers, and they start lobbying the federal government. For a couple of years, the Roosevelt administration stands pretty strong by the charge of the Farm Security Administration, but then World War II comes along, and the food supply becomes a national security issue. It becomes part of the building a weapon of democracy to fight fascism overseas. So now, when growers are talking about a labor shortage, it's starting to get the attention of federal officials. This is despite the fact that in 1943, Palm Beach County won an A award from the War Production Bureau for agricultural production. Regardless, they're seeing rising wages, and they're having a little trouble getting workers to the field. So they fight to secure an emergency war labor importation program. This is also called the British West Indies program. If you know anything about agricultural or labor history, it's very similar to the Bracero program that was established with Mexico. The U.S. established a bilateral agreement with Mexico that brought in around 52,000 workers annually to work in the fields of California and the Southwest. And Florida growers fought for a similar program with the Caribbean, and they got it. They brought in guest workers, so these are workers that are on visas contingent on their employment with the growers in the Everglades, coming from countries like the Bahamas and Jamaica. This was a much smaller program. They only brought in around 13,000 workers annually. But unlike the Bracero program, which was terminated in the mid-1960s, this one lives on. In 1952, it becomes a permanent program with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's now known as the H-2B program. It was the H-2 program for a while. But the recruitment of guest workers becomes a permanent feature of industrial agricultural production in the Everglades. And it fosters a 50% growth in agricultural output by the end of the 1940s. So that's really the foundation that we're working with, that growers, the operating environment for growers as World War II comes to a close. They've secured a visa contingent foreign workforce, and they've secured an extensive water management system that makes it secure to grow their tomatoes and their winter vegetables and their sugar. So by the 1950s, we're seeing that Florida is really at the forefront of major changes to the U.S. food system. This is a period across the country of small farms folding, of agricultural consolidation, of the growth of big agribusiness. Florida, over 40% of small farms folded in the 1950s. And as I said, 1/3 of all farmland by the late 1960s came to be owned by corporate interests. But it was through this kind of coordination and association that these large growers, while things were difficult for the small growers, large growers emphasized cooperation, they emphasized association, in order to harmonize production, continue to manage farm labor and the environment, and advance political agendas to secure their market share. And this kind of cooperation among growers becomes key when after the Cuban Revolution, when you have an exodus of sugar growers to South Florida, they become enmeshed in this culture of cooperation, and it fuels an exponential growth of sugar production. So these are some of the major agricultural, in the way here, associations and cooperatives. You have the Florida Farm Bureau, the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable Association, the FFVA is a big one. Florida Citrus Mutual, many of you may be familiar with that one. The Sugarcane Growers Cooperative of Florida, which came in 1960. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But some examples. So I put some influential agricultural families here. So many of these, the Wedgeworth family, the Graham family, the Duda family, these were initially smaller growers, mid-sized growers that ended up forming extensive, massive corporate family farming interests. So in the 1920s, the Wedgeworth family is really grew under George Wedgeworth and his mother, Ruth. His father died. He established the farm. He was a agricultural scientist who established a farm in the Everglades, and he died in the 1920s. But George Wedgeworth became a major figure in coordinating growers and moving produce growers into sugar. You have the Graham family. I think many of you all know Bob Graham, but his father, Ernest Graham, was the patriarch of that family. He actually worked for Pensuco Sugar, the Pennsylvania Sugar Company, as an engineer. And that folded in the Great Depression, and they gave him 7,000 acres near Miami to a severance, basically. And he started a cattle farm. He launched a political career from there, diversified into real estate development and sugar as well. And then the Duda family. I have props here. So that's Andrew Duda at the bottom. He was a Polish immigrant, and he came here in the 1920s and kind of maniacally reinvested his profits into new technologies and expansion. And over time, he became the largest celery grower in the country. This is his brand, the Dandy brand. You also see the little oranges often. That's the Duda family, this guy here. But if you look on the back of this package, this was purchased at Publix. It says it's from Salinas, California. So this man who came from Poland, and an immigrant, and on something like 60 acres to start, built a multinational empire. They expanded across the country in fresh produce. They have farms in Mexico and Chile. So this is the kind of expansion we're talking about. These are growers that go from corporate farming in the Everglades to global market shapers. The Von Hool family I'll get into in a second, but these pictures here on the left are from FFVA flyer or circulars. The one at the top here, you probably can't read the caption, but it shows these two gentlemen displaying the association's labor recruitment booklet, which gave guidance to growers on how to recruit. The FFVA actually derives most of its operating money from moving around Caribbean workers and domestic migratory workers through farms, so it acted as a labor contractor. That was the bulk of the money that it took in. And at the bottom here, I didn't just include that for the girls, but but because of the theme of that conference, you can't really see it, but it says at the bottom, mighty nice teamwork. So I think that's a good representation of the ethos of these associations and growers at the time. They were emphasizing teamwork and cooperation over competition in order to expand and consolidate. The FFDEA and similar associations had different committees for crops, like there were celery committees, tomato committees, and so on. They also had different political committees, water control committees, and through these associations, growers really developed class ties, the advanced political agendas. Andrew Duda here, he said farming and celery was quite difficult until they formed an exchange so that they could have as much bargaining power as the chain stores. So these growers are marketing their produce to the chain stores that are dictating prices to them. But through these associations, they're able to basically collectively bargain with the chain stores and raise prices and increase profits. So that's basically where things stand in 1959 when this all gets shaken up by the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro marches through Havana, and the Eisenhower administration, later the Kennedy administration, imposed an embargo. Before the revolution, Cuba exported 90% of the domestic sugar supply, the U.S. sugar supply. This is a little complicated, but the U.S. sugar program started in the New Deal, governed the sugar market. So they had allotments for domestic producers and allotments for international producers to export their products to the U.S. And Cuba was by far and away the largest producer of sugar. It blew domestic producers out of the park. And when that embargo takes place, not only does it put economic pain on the Castro administration and the Castro government, it creates a new market opportunity for U.S. growers. There's now 90% of the U.S. market in sugar is now open. So the Kennedy administration opens up quotas to domestic producers. At the same time, you have exiled Cuban sugar magnates leaving the island. They're getting forced out at gunpoint. These growers flock to South Florida, where industrial agricultural sugar production has already established a foothold, where there's a secure labor supply, where there's secure water management systems in place, and good muck soil to grow their sugar cane. So between 1960 and 1962, the acreage of sugar production goes from 160,000 to 380,000. Firms like U.S. Sugar expand production. U.S. Sugar opened a new mill in 1961. George Wedgeworth, who I mentioned, he gathers together South Florida's vegetable growers to form a co-op, the Cane Growers Cooperative, in 1960, to get these vegetable growers in on the action and on the sugar production. Big firms from out of state, like King Ranch, come in and establish fields. The Likes Company gets into sugar production. And then Cuban-American sugar firms start to form as well. There's Talisman Sugar, the Cuban-American Sugar Company. In total, in between 1960 and 1979, new sugar mills open in the Everglades, all in South Florida. And that really fuels the growth, the exponential growth of sugar production. And really the most influential family of that group that came in from Cuba after the revolution was the Fanjul family. You have Alfonso and Jose Fanjul here. They're in Palm Beach, celebrating their success. they reestablished themselves. They were some of the biggest sugar growers and marketers in Cuba before the revolution. Their family had a sugar brokerage firm in New York, as well as massive sugar holdings in Cuba. Alfonso Fanjul, who is the father, that's Alfonso Jr. On the left there. He comes in 1960 after the revolution. They're forced out of their home, which is now the National Museum of Art in Cuba. Because they have these family connections, because they have these business connections in New York, they're able to kind of settle in. Their family connections put them up in a Manhattan apartment. They buy a Cadillac, but then they start to plan how are we going to get back into this sugar business? And like many Cuban American sugar firms that formed in this period, they marshaled together the experts who left Cuba. They marshaled together what remaining capital they have, all their networks, and they move milling equipment from Louisiana by barge to South Florida. And they had a fairly small. They were actually initially a fairly small firm. They were only producing around 10,000 tons of sugar the first couple of years, and their holdings got flooded out in 1962, I believe. But by 1966, they were producing 50,000. They had good connections. They had capital. They were able to access markets because they knew the market very well. This cooperation extended to not only their Cuban counterparts, but to U.S. growers as well. The Fanjul started working with George Wedgeworth and the Sugarcane Growers Cooperative to assist them in building their own mill. U.S. Sugar refused to mill the sugar of the cooperative members. They were seen as a competitor. The Fanjuls, they reached out. They gave references to different sugar experts and engineers and helped them build a new mill in the 1960s. Wedgeworth later says it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Cubans in this period. And together they start to form new lobbying groups. There's the Sugarcane League forms in Washington, D.C., which is their lobbying outfit. They push to harden the embargo on Cuba, to stop the export of molasses to other countries, and to secure subsidies and production quotas for continued production quotas for U.S. growers. So between the Fanjuls, the Sugarcane Growers Cooperative, and U.S. Sugar, those are the big three firms that you now hear often referred to as Big Sugar in Florida, the Big Sugar lobby. So that's how it comes into being, through these cooperative relationships. And this is another prop. Fanjul Sugar. Florida Crystals is their brand. You probably have all seen this before. It's nicely marketed as organic now and regenerative. But there are debates to be had. But if you look on the back, it says distributed by Domino Foods Inc. in West Palm Beach. So they're like, Domino Foods, that doesn't seem like it's based in Florida. Well, in 1998, the Fanjuls get together with the Sugarcane Growers Cooperative, and they form a formal business partnership and form the American Sugar Refiners, the ASR Group, which became the largest integrated sugar business in the world. They purchased Domino Sugar, they purchased Tate and Lyle, which is another major sugar producer in Commonwealth countries. And now we see Domino Sugar, you see Florida Crystals. That's all from this cooperation between Fanjuls and the cooperative. So let's get back to the workers. So kind of the underside of this is, as production is exploding, there's a stretching of labor of these 13,000 Caribbean workers that are recruited every year from the Caribbean. The federal government, under the Kennedy and Johnson administration, they're liberals. They're not at all interested interested in expanding guest worker programs. But the sugar interests, they successfully lobbied and convinced them that it would be impossible to find U.S. workers to cut cane. It's just too arduous. And during the Cold War, they were also afraid to cut Jamaica off from the program because there was some political unrest in Jamaica. The Cuban Revolution just happened. They didn't want to alienate an ally in the Caribbean at this time. So they let the H2 program continue. You see this picture on the upper right is an H2 cane worker working everglades cane fields. And those nice New Deal labor camps, those are sold off to growers for about $1 a home. And this is kind of the condition they turn into. They are also isolated. Workers are not allowed to bring in outside guests, lawyers, social service workers, organizers, priests, anyone. So the conditions for both domestic and international migratory workers deteriorates through this period. But then you're in the 1960s, right? This is like the era of big labor. This is the era of Kennedy and Johnson, big liberal reforms. So these two things start to collide in the 1960s, and you have another moment of conflict between labor and management. And diverse populations of farm workers begin to build on government reforms and mobilize for improved wages and working conditions and union contracts. Not surprisingly, these were eventually quashed through this cooperation to recruit foreign workers. Organized agricultural interests continued to expand the workforce and diversify the workforce and undermine organizing through the 1960s and 70s. This conflict basically, you could kick it off with the Edward R. Murrow's documentary, Harvest of Shame, which came out in 1960. He was looking at scenes like this. I actually have that's him right there in the upper left with his trademark cigarette. Can't do that anymore. So he documented scenes of squalor and impoverished families, like children who weren't going to school in California and South Florida. He focused on the towns of Immokalee and Belglade in Florida, and then he went throughout California for that. And it came out Thanksgiving Day. It's like, this is how the food gets to your table in your bountiful Thanksgiving table. While you're enjoying your Thanksgiving meal, these farm workers are starving, right? So this sets off a liberal reform impulse. The Kennedy administration it ends the Bracero program. It pushes through a minimum wage for farm workers, not on par with the minimum wage for other workers, but it is a minimum wage. It pushes through some farm labor contracting regulations. And at this time, you also have organic organizing efforts taking place in California. The United Farm Workers forms in 1964 when Filipino and Mexican American farm workers come together and initiate the Delano grape boycott. They form the first farm labor union at that time, and they get the attention of organized labor as a whole. The AFL-CIO, the federation that represents trade unions in the United States, the Federation of Trade Unions, starts to invest in farm worker organizing in California through their industrial union department, which is headed by the United Auto Workers president, Walter Reuther. The UFW continues to see success throughout California, and while I think our understanding of the farm workers movement, the history of the farm workers movement is really centered on California, at this time there were similar organizing efforts happening in Texas and in Florida. The Industrial Union Department invested money in an organizing effort in Florida, centered around Belglade. In 1966, they signed up some 10,000 workers signed union cards to form an agricultural workers union in Florida. This was obviously inspired fierce resistance among growers and their associations. The filed lawsuits under Florida's right to work laws. They cut deals with farm labor contractors who were also going out on strike because they weren't really getting a good cut of wages either. They cut a deal with them to increase profits for contractors so they would split apart from farm workers. And most importantly, they continued this process, strengthening these systems of foreign labor recruitment. In the West, with the ending of the Bracero program, higher wages led to mechanization in California. So now there are more and more farm workers looking for work, and there are farm labor contractors in Florida bringing them in. This is expanding the labor market and making competition for wages much higher. It also starts to change the face of farm work in Florida. You see some pictures of strikers here. Before this, we were mainly talking about African American migratory workers and Caribbean workers, but if you can't really tell, but by the late 1960s, some 30% of the farm workforce was Latino, and this trend continues. So we have, in the late 1960s, we have some organic, some locally based organizations rise up and try and form a union. One of them is called OMICA, the Organized Migrants and Community Action. United Farm Workers actually successfully organizes a local here in Florida, in Fort Pierce, Florida. They organized Coca-Cola's Minute Maid fields. But this constant recruitment, this churn in the labor market continues and starts to undermine these organizing efforts and makes it more and more difficult to build solidarity and a strong union. By 1980, more than 70% of the farm workforce was Latino. So this is a dramatic change in how quickly the farm workforce is changing. It's changing the whole social landscape of South Florida. And more than half of those workers were undocumented, who have extra vulnerabilities and are less likely to appeal to public authorities with labor violations because of their status. So that mainly undermines these promising moments of organizing in the 1960s and early 1970s. So that's really that kind of brings together the three key legs of the stool, I would say. And I think the history of the development and operations of industrial agriculture in South Florida shows how it remade this vast landscape and changed the social landscape of our region, of our state today. As a little bit of a postscript, it's not like farm labor organizing went away. There are still numerous organizations that are active today. You have, just run through quickly, I don't know if we have much time, but there's Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the Florida Association of Farm Workers, groups like Centro Campesino, MUPER, and Student Farm Workers Alliance, which is an auxiliary group of students that support farm workers campaigns in the state. So any students here, maybe check that out. So there are ongoing campaigns still today for improved wages against pesticide and heat exposure. There are programs to build sustainable agriculture in rural communities. And the fight continues for sustainable housing, clean housing, healthcare, and freedom from sexual harassment. So the story doesn't end. This dynamic continues. But I think I'm looking forward to questions at this point.
I think we have really good acoustics in here, so I don't think we need a microphone. So anybody
Yeah,
have any questions?
I can hear.
Anybody have a question?
I think, yes.
Would you elaborate on any connection between the state of environment
that's complicated. I don't get into it a lot in my research, but the success among Cuban American sugar interests this was a major funding source for anti-Castro activities in South Florida. I mentioned briefly the Talisman Sugar Corporation. The head of that was a major funder of anti-Castro efforts, and even led a flotilla to Havana, supported some of the Bay of Pigs, invasion. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a connection, and I think over time those interests, one, because economically we sort of depend on that embargo. Maybe not so much today. I don't know that sugar production in Cuba is anywhere near where it used to be. But they do continue to fight to keep that foothold secure. And then there's also the ideology, the anti-Castro ideology, because these people were exiled from their country. They continue, and they have capital to invest in anti-Castro efforts. That kind of continues on through the 60s, 70s, and through today.
Thank you.
You touched on this. I think if you watch, it's been a while since I've seen it, if you watch Harvest of Shame, the workers are overwhelmingly African American.
Right.
And within a decade or so, it switched dramatically to be overwhelmingly Latino. What's the explanation for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really like part of why the story is so incredible. Like, not only is the landscape changing so quickly, but the communities are changing so quickly, and the workforce is changing so quickly. And I think one of the points I want to make with this is that there's intentionality behind it. These things are not there. There are push and pull factors to migration, but a big part of that is a systematic effort among growers to bring in more workers, to expand the workforce so that they have a greater degree of control over workers, so that they can exacerbate vulnerabilities among migrant workers that are easier to move around. There becomes a whole cottage industry built up under the associations I mentioned, but I don't mean like under formally, but beneath that, kind of a more underworld kind of element of farm labor contractors that continue to bring in workers from Mexico, from Central America, in charging fees, bringing them to housing. There's widespread trafficking. So while there are sort of political, economic push factors from countries like Mexico, where there's an economic crisis through the 70s and 80s, there's civil wars in Central America. There's also the pull factors that you have to keep in mind that are, you can really point to these systematic efforts to bring in new workers through this period. But you're right, it's dramatic, and I touched on that a little bit, just like how quickly it changes through that period.
Have you had the opportunity to go into South Florida? And years ago, I had to make a lot of trips to Miami, so I went the back way.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of scary because you're out in the middle of nowhere. You could just really disappear.
Yeah.
You go down when you get to Belgrade and Clueston,
Mhm.
all those places go
Right.
around like Okeechobee.
Yeah.
I wondered where I was
Mm-hmm.
because all you can see are just,
Mm-hmm.
it's lonely.
It is. It's very remote.
Very weird
It's
and
very
remote.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about that, I was thinking about those trips I took along the
Mhm.
back route and how safe it probably was or wasn't. But the road that I took, you're on 27 going down that way and then cut
Right.
over on the,
Yeah.
and
It's
to
an
me
interesting
it
drive.
seemed unreal that they could even tame that landscape because it was
Mhm.
just, it's just so vast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, you're right. And you can see, I mean, just the size of some of these farms when you're driving through here, when you're driving through there. I mean, they've diversified even from my story. Like, you see big sod farms and things like that. And there's a lot of
Sod.
nurseries and stuff too, like around Homestead. That used to be more tomato. It's now a lot more nurseries there.
And you see cricket.
Cricket.
Yeah. People playing cricket.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's West Indian. They're
Yeah.
West Indian influence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
more point to that, like the remoteness of the area makes it much harder to like escape, right? Like if you're a worker and you're kind of trapped in
We'd be trapped.
circumstances, there's like really nowhere to go sometimes.
Charlie,
Yeah, so,
Are the
Yeah.
sugar growers cooperating with the restoration of the river grass?
now I think that's debatable, and I wouldn't say I'm an expert on current Everglades politics, but I think to some degree, perhaps. And I think you could definitely make the argument that like the organic production of cane sugar in and around Clewiston is probably having less of a negative environmental impact than if they developed that into like suburbs.
do you know that the Fanjul families, they went back to Cuba during the Obama administration? Okay.
Yeah.
You hear about
I
that?
did, yeah.
And they talked about taking back the farms, and the Cuban government talked about that they needed them to take over the farms that used to be theirs and to maybe make them productive again, because up until I think a couple years ago, the Cubans produced as much sugar as they had produced in 1900. That's how backwards
Yeah.
the sugar cane industry is in Cuba now. They're actually importing sugar from France and Brazil,
Yeah, I read that. They're importing sugar now. Yeah.
which is incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Fanjul family, I don't think nothing came out of that, but
Yeah.
they were in talks with the Cuban government.
I think they made a stir of controversy when like Alfonso, maybe one of them said like, oh, we might be willing to kind of go back there.
And they weren't happy here in Miami.
Yeah, right.
I wanted to ask if you knew anything about, I lived out in Texas for a long time, and I lived in Sugar Land. And we had
Oh, yeah.
imperial sugar out there, and I was wondering how or why the King Ranch family that are way south Texas
Yeah.
got involved down here in Florida,
Yeah.
and they had sugar out there. I mean,
Yeah,
I
I think
wonder what the connection was. That's what I was just gonna ask if you knew, because I don't.
it's a market opportunity. they
Yeah,
saw.
just an opportunity, I guess, to diversify.
Yeah.
You mentioned the influence these cooperatives had on federal and state legislation. What's the enduring legacy they had on the local areas, like Clewiston, developing
Mhm.
politics and settlements around?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in terms of local politics, I couldn't say with a lot of certainty. I mean, I think they had very close relationships with like local sheriffs, for example. But I mean, if you go out there, I think the influence is like really, you could see it on the landscape. Like it's dominated by these interests.
And I ask because this is basically in my backyard. I'm from Naples.
Oh, wow, yeah,
I've
okay.
been through the area. You can see little like placards, U.S. sugar
Mhm.
here, there throughout. If you pass through like Clewiston, you'll see
Yeah.
them everywhere. So I was wondering what the like intangible.
Yeah.
was.
I mean, it starts the drive from like Naples into like Immokalee, and
Yeah.
then you continue on. It's like you can really, it's two different worlds, really.
How has the introduction of technology to these like agricultural areas affected the opportunities of work for the migrant workers?
That's a good question. So one case I could point to is these big sugar firms no longer bring in guest workers. They mechanized the sugar fields in the 1990s. For a long time, they said like the nature of the muck soil and made it basically impossible to mechanize, but then they were hit with like $100 million lawsuits for wage theft, and then they found a way to do it. So yeah, they improved the technology. I think they maybe like I don't want to say anything incorrect, but I think they fiddled with like tire technology or something like that to be able to mechanize these fields. So yeah, I mean there are certain. For a long time, the mechanization was difficult in the Everglades just because of the nature of the ecosystem, but I think more and more it's mechanizing. The fresh produce is a little bit different because it has to be hand-picked, and like the technology is just not there yet to where you could pick a lot of tomatoes without tearing them up and bruising them. So that still requires a lot of labor. Yes, sir.
What is the current average income of these sugar workers?
Ooh, I mean that would change over time. I don't have a not, it's, the guest worker programs regulate wages so that there's not an adverse impact on domestic wages. So there is some regulation over time, that the Department of Labor calculates for these guest workers. For undocumented workers or U.S. farm workers, it's really dependent on market forces, but I mean it's far below the poverty line.
I'll try to project. Okay. So within Florida, even in say like the past 10 years or so, I know there's been a massive boom with architectural ventures and like a lot of like suburbs and new developments and things like that kind of popping up in that sense. Do you foresee that becoming an issue in the agricultural space in regards to workers or spaces like that?
Well, I mean, I think that you've seen it like through the 80s, 90s, and more recently. It's sort of in the freezes in the 1980s, citrus freezes. You start to see more and more agricultural firms offload their land for development, things like that. Like the Chase family was a very big citrus interest in Florida. And I think it was the 1980s. They sold their holdings for development, golf course. So as land values go up, that becomes more enticing, I think, and you see more and more